Okay, so as I mentioned, the task we have for the next week, 3 weeks, is to understand human development, and I have emotions on here because it's a very important component of studying human development. Um, and let's just kind of go through and first give some quick definitions of what we mean by human development, growth and development, and how it differs from the other topics that we are going to study in the class. Okay. The most simple definition of the study of human development is it's a study of how people change over time. When we look at other areas of psychology, such as cognition, decision making, those types of things, we're usually taking a snapshot in time, uh, where we have a person do a task in a specific situation. Human development and the study of human development is different because what we're interested in is not that snapshot, but how individuals change over time. Okay. Now, it should be noted that most of developmental psychology has focused on 0 to 18. Mainly because it was assumed, and we'll see with the first theorist, Sigmund Freud, that it was assumed that when we reach 18 and we become an adult, that we no longer develop anymore. That once we hit 18, that's going to be our intelligence level, that's going to be our personality, that's going to be just who we are for the remainder of our life. And so this was a big misunderstanding in the human developmental literature, and it kind of influenced the study of human development for a good 100 to 200 years. Okay. However, especially over the last 30 years, more attention has been focused on adulthood and development changes during adulthood, because we've now recognized that we do continue to develop after the age of 18. We have personality changes, intelligent level changes. We have cognitive inclines where we actually get better with decision making and different other problem solving skills. And then during later adulthood, we start to see some of those cognitive and emotional benefits start to decline as we age. So we look at human performance, it's kind of U-shaped over the lifespan. So, and mainly the reason why we've extended the study beyond 18 is that in the last 120 years, thanks to medical advancements and modern medicine and understanding of sanitation and all of those things, is in the last 120 years, the lifespan has doubled for people. About 120 years ago, our expected lifespan was between about 30 to 40 years of age. But in the last 120 years, it's doubled to almost the age of 80. On average, I believe the United States is at 77, with women living longer and men living not as long. And so, this actually should say the number 2, but some have argued that we actually are starting to live 2 lifetimes, one going from 0 to 40 and the other going from 40 to the end of our life. And as we will see, the arguments for that is because we see some major conflicts and issues that start to occur between the age of 35 to 45, which kind of denote kind of almost a change in lifestyle. This is where we see people change careers the most. This is when we see people change life, family life situations, such as divorce or such as a separation of those types. And so we see major transitions that occur during this time. And as we'll see, probably in week 3, this time period between about 35 to 45 is really tumultuous in a sense, because it really is almost a transition from one life to another. And so we'll look at the arguments for that as well. We'll also look at things that are called cohort effects. Okay, this is This is changes in development, or changes in expectations of development that are due to the time and age we live in. Okay, probably as an example, the backbone of American society used to be people in their middle age, between the age of about 29, 25, well, let's go 25 to about the age of 55. And the reason why they were the backbone is that they're the ones that held the jobs, held family together. They're the ones that kind of made society move forward. But we've seen in about the last now 40 years that has transitioned. And we actually see this age group about between the age of about 30 to about 50 suffering really bad. This is where we're seeing the highest levels of substance abuse, use of antidepressants, anti-anxiety, job turnover, relationship problems and issues. It's this age group that is becoming the most, again, tumultuous. And that's what we call a cohort effect, because it seems to be a generational issue with our current generation. So, and we'll talk more about cohort effects as we move along as well. The study of development, I would definitely argue, is important for counselors, social workers, parents, and those who care for adult children or parents. I will tell you that in the years when I was doing clinical work as a counselor and a therapist, and I also supervised clinically social workers, probably the one textbook that most counselors had, and I know I had it in my drawer, was our textbook on human development, because that seemed to be the resource we'd continually go to in order to help individuals. And interestingly, most nursing and medical programs require a course in human development, especially for RN programs here in the state of Arizona. Most require the study of human development. So again, in this introductory class, we'll spend about 3 weeks talking about human development and its important influence on ourselves and on our families, and even bleeding into some of the professions that we have. So that's kind of my quick introduction to why we study development and what it is. And so let's go on and let's get into kind of some of the meat and bones of it with this, again, introductory lecture, where we'll just get into some of the theories, some of the thoughts, the areas that we focus on when we're talking about human development. And then starting on Friday, unless we don't get done with this section, we'll kind of slow down and we'll start with infancy and work our way through adulthood. So that's if we get through today. We'll see. Okay. So when we're studying human development, there's 3 areas of development that we take into account. The first one is biological processes. So biological processes are things or changes that occur physiologically, okay? And this is important because you'll see that we use a Venn diagram, because biological development is going to influence cognitive development, and it's going to influence socio-emotional development. And in turn, we'll see how cognitive development, which we'll define here in a minute, influences biological changes, okay, and socio-emotional changes. And to kind of preface why these biological changes are important is because they influence our thought processes, which is cognitive development. So cognition, when we think of cognition, this is decision-making, this is being able to do reflection, this is attention, this is intelligence. all of those kind of thought processes, okay? When we look at socio-emotional processes, this is our interaction between our world and us and how we develop emotionally as human beings, okay? To kind of give a preview of why this is important, we can look at early childhood and we can look at adolescence and as far as biological changes and to kind of give some previews of some of the things that we need to discuss. Human beings are one of the very few species that are born with an underdeveloped brain. Okay, now to kind of express this, human beings don't have the largest brain of species. If we look at the brains of elephants and larger mammals, they definitely have much larger brains than we do. And how brain is usually compared, though, is it's compared to the body mass. The larger the body mass, the larger the brain the species has. What makes humans unique is that we deviate from this mass to brain volume measurement. Indeed, humans have an oversized brain for our body mass. And that's what kind of sets humans aside from other species we see. The problem is that the human brain is probably at its largest size that it can get at, okay? And what I mean by that is in order for an infant to pass through the vaginal canal without breaking mom's pelvic bones and whatnot, our brains cannot get much larger than they are. But what it also means is that we are born with an underdeveloped brain. Indeed, most of our brain develops between the age of 0 to 6. So this is a unique thing about being human, is that instead of our brains being fully developed in the comforts and nutrition of mother's womb, the majority of the human brain develops in a social cultural area outside of the mother's womb. And this is why, humans have one of the longest developmental periods, for one. Two, why human children need more supervision between the age of 0 to 6. And three, it's important to emphasize this, that it is really culture, the social world, the inputs we put into a child in those early years that will develop their brain to its best capacity, okay? So we can see 0 to 6 is going to be a very important age for us to study in this class because this is when biologically we're developing the most within these two other contexts, okay? And this is also when we get to things like language. That's why children between the age of 0 to 6 can learn language so well. And also other physical skills, okay? One thing that is interesting about language in and of itself as our brain is developing is that between the age of about 0 to 6, the average child will learn over 90,000 words. It's between 70 to 90,000 words. And then after the age of 6, our brain starts to trim back to only the words we most commonly use. And so if you think about that, the capacity of a young child is amazing. That's why children, it's best to try and learn more than one language during this developmental period. Why it's important to expose children to as many words as possible and many more dialects of words, because after the age of 6, it starts to trim away. Okay, so the other example of how biological processes influence socio-emotional processes is when we look at adolescence. Okay. And there's two things. Well, yeah, the one thing that is earmarked about adolescence is it's seen as this time period of tumultuousness and confusion for a lot of adolescents, and we hear the stories of, parents saying they did not have good experience raising adolescents. Okay. And we always thought that this was due to hormonal changes, that it was due to the rush of testosterone or estrogen as the male or female body was maturing physically. Okay. And so we should first talk about what is puberty. Because one of the mistakes that is made with puberty is that we think it's a one-time event and for example, with females, we count puberty as the first menstrual cycle. We'll talk about boys here in just a minute, but we'll stick with women because of there seems to be this clear biological marker. But the thing that I want everybody to understand in the class is that puberty is actually a 2 to 3 year process. And one of the things that occurs during that process is the brain becomes almost completely fully myelinated. Okay, before this period, the brain is largely unmyelinated. And if you remember myelin 1, it protects the axon of the cell, but it also speeds up the impulse itself. It kind of goes, instead of going 10 miles per hour, it's now going 200-300 miles per hour as kind of an analogy when the cell becomes myelinated. Now, why do we think that through childhood we have largely unmyelinated cells? Is because that allows for that solid learning process. When you have a slower brain, the memories and the information is being stored much stronger. And that's also why young children ask the same question over and over and over and over, because it's really getting that neural connection to occur. And so when you are working with a 3-4-year-old, don't get frustrated when they ask the same question over and over and over. It is their brain really trying to make those neural connections necessary. However, as we physically mature, and especially sexually mature, it doesn't make much sense to have, we need a much quicker decision-making brain. Okay, and an analogy is a car is coming at you at 50 miles an hour. It's much easier to have a brain that will trigger quickly to that and get out of the way versus a young child who might just stand there trying to figure out what they're supposed to be doing. Okay. This rapid myelination, though, occurs within about a 6-month period while a person is going through puberty. Okay. And so what does this mean? Well, what it means is that when a teenager does something and they answer they don't know why they did it, they probably don't, because their cognitive processes are far behind their biological processes. That, think about it. Their brain went from, in a couple month period, going from 5 miles per hour to all of a sudden it's going 200-300 miles per hour because of that rapid myelination. Okay. And so we see cognitive processes and social emotional processes lag behind this super hyper brain activity that's going on. Okay. And we find that going back and looking at adolescents who had what we call quote unquote easy adolescence, versus those who had very difficult times during adolescence. Now, barring any substance use or trauma that occurs that can cause adolescence to spiral. So we got to exclude that. We actually have looked at parents and how parents parent during adolescence. And what we found is so we go back to the example of the teenager. Let's say they did something stupid. You can make that up in your mind. And the parent asks, why the hell did you do that? And the child goes, I don't know. And the parent just criticizes the child, punishes them in some way, takes away their phone, whatnot. We find that those children have a very, very difficult adolescence because they don't understand why they did it, and they also don't understand why they're being punished for it. So not understanding cognitive, not understanding others' reactions to it, socio-emotional. Okay. However, we find that parents, when they ask their adolescent, why did you do that? And the adolescent says, well, I don't know. The parent that sits down and says, well, let's break it down. And they walk through what happened to the adolescent step by step by step, slowing down their brain, allowing their cognitive processes to catch up. And we found that parents with that parenting style have adolescents who actually have a less tumultuous adolescent period. They tend to have less of the issues that we see adolescents who have a tough time getting through adolescence does. So that, again, this is just an example of the interplay between biology, cognitive processes, and socio-emotional processes. We should, again, I mentioned earlier a cohort effect. We are seeing a cohort effect with puberty. So we consider puberty when someone physically matures. So their sex organs start producing sperm. They start to get what they'll have as an adult body. We go through what's, if for example, boys and girls through childhood were dressed exactly the same. So there was no cultural influence on how we dressed boys and girls. We would find that it would be hard to determine the difference between boys and girls because up till puberty, boys and girls are androgynous, meaning that if culture didn't dress our children or do their hair like they do, you really couldn't tell the difference between boys and girls, okay, because they're androgynous. When we go to puberty, we start getting our second sexual characteristics, facial hair, breast changes, widening in strength. That's when we start seeing differences between sexes, okay? So that's physical development into an adult body. And then we have psychological maturation, okay? Now, psychological maturation is defined this way. Psychological maturation is defined as kind of this kind of parable goes. So let's say you have $50 and your electric bill is due on Tuesday of next week. And let's say this is a Friday. So we're on a Friday, we have $50. Our power bill is due on Tuesday and it's $50. Okay. But we're at the mall and we see this shirt that we really, really like. And we try it on, it looks really good on us, and it's $50. Okay. The psychologically immature mind would buy the shirt and try to figure out how to pay their power bill later. The psychologically mature mind, okay, so that's the immature mind. The psychologically mature mind would forego buying the shirt and make sure that they pay their power bill, which is in the future. Okay, so it's kind of this idea of withholding gratification in order to be responsible and assure that your life continues the way your life should continue. Okay, the thing that we're seeing, and this is something that future psychologists in the room, future people who study these things, I hope you take this on as a dissertation. If you're interested in development, is that we're seeing the distance between physical maturation and psychological maturation getting further and further and further apart. Okay. If we looked at physical maturation, let's say 50, 60 years ago, it would have been the age of 16. And then if we looked at it in the 1980s, 1990s, it would be physical maturation would, okay, so it was about 15, 16, 50, 60 years ago. In the 80s and 90s, it went down to 12 to 13. And now we're down to 10 to 11 years old, okay, on average. Psychological maturation, again, when we look back 50, 60 years ago, equaled about the same rate as physical maturation, about the age of 16. But then in the 80s, it went up to 18, 90s, it went into 21. And today it's actually 27 is the average age for psychological maturation. So we're seeing physical maturation getting younger and younger and younger, and psychological maturation getting older and older and older, okay? And we see a gender difference in this as well. For example, with psychological maturation, as defined as being able to live independently on your own, take care of your own needs, and whatnot, we actually see a gender difference. For women, we see it at the age of 21 is when most women are able to live and survive on their own, okay, and take care of their own needs. The average age for men today is actually 34. That's the average age that average men are capable of taking care of themselves and living independently. And this is where we get that average age of 27. Okay. So what I'd like you to do in the chat, just to see if we're all kind of on the same page on this. And I should mention too, we are seeing some children going through the puberty by the age of 5 or 6. I think the youngest child recorded going through puberty was actually 4. When I worked with children who were sexually abused, the youngest abused child that I worked with that got impregnated was 8, and she gave birth to her child at 9. And it was her dad, which we'll talk about later in the course as well. So in the chat, what I'd like you to do is tell kind of, why do you think the difference between physical maturation and psychological maturation, the gap between it is getting larger and larger and larger? Put it in the chat and let me see where everyone is at with this. Don't be shy. Thank you, Amy. Okay. I'm seeing some great answers. And I would say there's answers that probably are not incorrect at all. Okay, these are some great answers, and we'll actually get to a lot of these um, as we move along. And we'll talk a little bit more about puberty, because there was some great things about the interplay between parents and children. I see that in there, and we will talk about that when we get to parenting, because we do know that an emotionally withheld mother and a non-participating father does predict the age at which a female will go through puberty. I'm seeing food, which is actually currently being investigated because of the who put it in there, GMOs and hormones that are used. Jordan mentioned that, and that is actually currently a line of investigation. So again, you're seeing physical, right, biological processes that are at play, and a lot of you are recognizing their societal things at play. Okay. There was another one. Someone mentioned location, and there is some denote to this, is because the United States here specifically, which we can talk about, is becoming more and more urbanized. And we have traditionally seen a difference between people who go through puberty in rural areas versus urban areas, with urban areas going through puberty younger than rural areas. And Jacob, yeah, the hormones, as we've talked about. Shawnee, I think technology probably plays a role, as we'll probably see a little bit later in the course. So great. You all kind of hit on different aspects that are kind of under investigation. I think you all hit on areas that probably are influencing these changes that we're seeing. One other issue too, though, is some have also argued that it's because of our expanded lifespan. That the need to grow or develop psychologically is not as burdensome as past generations, where you were only going to live 30 to 40 years. It was best to psychologically mature at an earlier age. So great. Thank you, everybody. Some great ideas, and we'll talk a lot about some of these as we move along through the development and also in other sections in the course. So, all right. So again, this was a discussion about the interplay between biology, which some of you noted with probably our processed foods, hormones in foods, probably plays a large role. Socio-emotional processes, such as parenting, as an example. Many of you mentioned society and societal expectations, cognitive processes. Later in the course, we're going to watch a video called The Demise of Guys, done by Philip Zimbardo, because one of the arguments is and when we look at that psychological maturation differences between women and men, is we're seeing women become much more successful than men are today. Women are graduating high school at a higher rate. They're entering college at a higher rate. They're going on to graduate programs at a higher rate. They have less employment turnover than men do. And we're seeing this decline of men. And we'll talk about this when we get to young adulthood specifically. But an interesting study that just kind of emphasized this when we get to young adulthood was there was a study a couple years ago that asked young men, we're talking between the age of 18 to about 35, if they had the ability to spend a weekend with their male friends versus a romantic weekend with their intimate partner, girlfriend, spouse, whoever it may be, which would they choose? And over 70% of the men who were surveyed in this actually chose a weekend with their friends rather than an intimate weekend with their girlfriend or intimate partner. And so we're seeing these changes in expectations that we'll talk about when we get to young adulthood. When we look at the makeup of even this class, when I went to college for an introductory to psychology class, it was about 2/3 males and 1/3 females. And if we look at the makeup of our class right now, we're at about 75% females and 25% males. And so we'll look at this and how that has really changed the dynamics between men and women, and really, where the place of our genders are, especially when we talk about genders here. I think we'll hit a lecture on genders probably early next week, and we'll come back to this subject, but I just wanted to kind of give a preview. Okay. All right. Does anybody have any questions at this point before we move on? Jacob, I think you have a very good point. So I think mental maturation older, because that is when people are able to think for themselves independently. Yes, I agree with that. So, okay. All right, so that's the interplay between these three areas. We'll come back. We've talked enough about biological processes, and you've all recognized that their biological processes can be influenced by the environment, such as the food we eat and those kinds of things. We'll come to talk about genes here in a little while. And so we'll come back to biological processes. But what I want to do at this moment is get into the different theories of human development. And probably the first theory that we should talk about is Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory. Now, we didn't have a chance to go through the different theories in psychology. We went through the different philosophies, but we never came back to this. So we'll spend a little bit of time more on these theories than we normally would for a developmental lecture. Okay. So first of all, I'm sure there's probably not anyone in the room who hasn't heard the name Sigmund Freud sometime during either your studies or in popular culture or the like. And the reason why Freud is such a pivotal person in the field of psychology and the study of mental life is there's a few things that he did. One, he was the first one to present a theory of mental life that was beyond the guise of philosophy or religion. Okay. So he was one of the first to give a kind of a formalized theory of the mind, as you would put. The other thing is, and if there's anybody in here who's going into counseling, psychotherapy, and the like in the class, he would be a person I would encourage you to take a closer look at, because he is him and his colleague, I can't remember his first name, his last name is Brunner. Sigmund Freud and Brunner were the first ones to come up with the term the talking cure, and to use a formalized method to analyze people and help them through talking instead of some physiological treatment or some faith-based treatment. They were the first to kind of formalize this thing we now call psychotherapy and counseling. So when you look at the roots of modern psychotherapy and counseling, the roots really start with Sigmund Freud. Now, that doesn't mean there wasn't any other forms before that. We know that in many faith communities, people would go to their priest or their pastor or their religious leader for guidance. We know among Native American communities pre-colonial that talking circles were really important. We have ideas of things like sweat lodges and using the shamans or leaders within them. So it's not to say that people didn't rely on other people who had expertise, but Sigmund Freud was the first to say we can have a formalized profession of counseling and psychotherapy. Okay. Now, I am going to put straight up front that Sigmund Freud's theory, while he meant it to be generalizable to everyone, it's important to understand that his theory was built upon his clinical population, which he worked mainly with people that were mentally ill, sexually assault victims, and the criminally minded individuals. So when you're thinking about Freud, there's a couple things to keep in mind. One, it is based on a clinical population. And two, it was based during a time of very sexual conservatism, meaning that it wasn't appropriate to talk about your sexual needs and your sexual desires. And so there was a repression of any type of sexual forwardness, okay? And what he's going to come up with, let me back up just a little bit more, is that Sigmund Freud was actually, he wanted to become a researcher. He was very interested in physiology. In fact, his dissertation did something with the physiology of a frog. And he very much wanted to be a scientist. But because he came from Jewish descent, he wasn't allowed into academia. And so he ended up going into medicine, into psychiatry specifically, and working on the neurological aspects of human behavior, okay? So here we have a gentleman who was a scientist, wanted to be a scientist, wanted a theory based on science, but ended up being a practitioner because of his religious and cultural and ethnicity. Okay, and so he wanted to base it on something scientific, and at the time, the huge theory that was really being developed in the area of science was the theory of evolution, specifically Darwin's theory of evolution. And what Freud believed is, based on evolution, that there must be some drives that everybody has, everybody in the world has, that create mental life and the mind, okay? And he's going to come up with two basic, what we can call instincts or drives. One is eros, which is life-giving, Thanatos, which is the death instinct. So one's the life instinct and one's the death instinct. But Freud needed to narrow these down to behaviors and mental processes. So eros, which is the life instincts, he reduced down to sexual desires and sexual needs. He's going to reduce the death instinct, which is Thanatos, to aggression, the need for aggression, okay? And because of his time and his period of when he was developing his theory, he's going to say that these basic instincts exist within the unconscious, and he's going to divide mental life into two things using what's called an iceberg model, where 10% of an iceberg sits above the wave and 90% sits below the wave, okay? And he's going to put the majority of our mental life in the unconscious, and he's going to emphasize the unconscious processes of the human and say that it is the unconscious that drives all of our mental life. And our conscious is just those safe things that we're aware of. Okay. Now, let's explain his different components of the unconscious. So he's going to put our sex and aggression instincts into what he called the id. Okay. This is a German word. Its closest translation into English would be it, but it goes beyond that. It is it. It is everything, the id. Okay. And it is the id that gives us all of our psychic energy. It's what gives life to our mental life. Okay. However, if you could imagine this situation, if human beings were going around and just trying to have sex with somebody while beating up the person next to them, releasing all of those different drives, the human species probably would have not existed very long. We would have not survived our evolutionary or whatever gains in life. So what Freud argued is that the id developed an ego. The ego has access to the external world and has access to the needs of the unconscious, the sexual and aggressive drives of the unconscious, okay? And so the ego is this constant decision-making part of our system that tries to satisfy our primitive sexual and aggressive needs while also meeting the social demands of the external world, okay? Now, Freud was very extreme on this, okay? He believed that, for example, if he was here lecturing, not me, Sigmund Freud was here lecturing, he would argue that you are all not here trying to learn all of this stuff to become better in your life or to become a better person or to advance your career. You're not there taking notes and trying to be impressive. No, he would argue that the reason why you're all behaving the way you are in this class is because it increases the chances that you might have some type of sexual encounter with some other person in the class at a later date. Okay. That's how extreme Freud was on his theory. It did get lightened up later on, and didn't become as that extreme in later versions when other people took on psychoanalysis. Okay. Now, what Freud also argued is that as humans evolved and we came up with these social contracts, we developed things called religion, we developed things called governments and everything, and we ended up, we had this contract with each other. He argued that the ego and the id developed the superego. And the superego is the perfection ego. It is the what he would call the moral ego. Okay. Now, moral is not, in Freudian terms, is not happiness. It's not doing what's good. Morality for Freud was that you were a perfectionist. So in social situations, if your superego really dominates your unconscious, this is the person who has everything perfect. They act appropriate in every setting. They behave in a perfect form, okay, according to the social demands of the world. That for him is what the superego was. Again, this got softened up over the years, but this is kind of the pure model of Freudian theory. Okay. Now, based on this, so Freud developed this model, and he came to realize that, a lot of the focus in his therapy was focusing on early childhood, that a lot of quote unquote adults became messed up in their early childhood, specifically with their relationship with their mother. And so what he felt he needed to do is he needed to develop a developmental theory of childhood. Now, a lot of people think that Freud developed his developmental theory first before his actual theory, but that's actually backwards. He developed his developmental theory later on. And as you'll see, he probably had been sniffing a little bit too much cocaine by this time, because you'll see some oddities that are definitely made fun of in our popular culture, okay? But when it comes to Freudian theory, the thing that I do want to say is that he introduced the idea of stage theory. Stage theory you're going to see throughout developmental psychology, where people progress through stages and if we're successful in one stage, it sets us up to be successful in the next stage. And then if we're successful in that stage, it sets us up to be successful in the next stage. And he was the one to really introduce this notion of stage theory. And interestingly, Freud developed a psychosexual theory. And one thing that is interesting about Freud is he really didn't want his developmental theory to be about sex. But because his theory itself would have been inconsistent if he didn't, he had to sexualize childhood. And it's interesting that he originally actually didn't want to do that, but he was forced to because of his theory. So the first theory of development is what we call a psychosexual stages of human development, okay? And what he's going to argue is that in each stage of development, the child is fulfilling some pleasure from that and some type of gratification from the use of the different body parts that we'll look at. And the first stage of development that Freud argued was that we go through the oral stage of development. Okay, the oral stage, because that's where we get our sustenance from sucking of the mother's breast or the bottle. And there's great satisfaction in an infant. And if you ever notice an infant, the first thing they always do with an object is they put it in their mouth. And so Freud felt that the first stage of development is the oral phase of development. And he actually argued, so if we don't learn how to gratify that need in an appropriate way, then we become fixated in that stage of development, okay? And indeed, he actually died of jaw cancer and because of cigar smoking. And he believed that he himself actually was orally fixated because from an early age on, we're talking 12, 13 years of age, he could not go a day without having a cigar, okay? And so what he believed is that children who become orally fixated become consumers, that he believed this explained things like obesity. He believed this explained things like addiction, overconsumption, the need for instant gratification orally. And so he believed that a person who is orally fixated becomes a consumer. They continually need to consume something, okay? Now, the next stage of development, he called the anal phase. And the anal phase is associated with potty training, okay? And if you think about potty training, if I feel if there's something we should give a award for, it is when a child potty trains. That should be just as important as a high school diploma. And let me explain why. Because there's a couple things that potty training demands on an individual. One, it's going to be the first time we give in to the demands of our external world, to an authority figure, our parents, who are going to say what we're doing is not appropriate. The second thing that potty training requires is for us to take control of our biological processes. And so what I mean by that is deciding that, no, I'm not going to potty or defecate now. I'm going to wait until I'm in an appropriate place and time to do that kind of action. So it represents two things: giving in to the demands of an authority, and for the first time, taking control of our biological processes, okay? Now, what did Freud believe if you weren't able to control your biological processes? Well, if anybody has ever heard the term "you're anal," or that person has a really anal personality, this is where this comes from. Because what Freud believed is that a person who is anally fixated is someone who, because they cannot take internal control of themselves, exert excessive control on their environment and people around them. So this is the person who has their shoes in their closets perfectly done, their clothes in their closet perfectly in shape. This is the person who gets a little bit out of whack when something unpredictable happens, and they have to have control over everything. Okay, so that's where the term "you're being anal" comes from. Okay, and so that's the second stage of development. All right. The third stage of development, and I'm hoping everyone doesn't see the validity in this, but they see the cultural aspects of this, okay, is the phallic stage. Okay, there's something that today we even recognize happens before birth, and that is children find areas of their body that feel really good. And it's not uncommon to see a child as young as 1 or 2, in his 3, 4, 5, and 6, touching themselves or masturbating. Okay. And in fact, we actually have evidence that children masturbate even while still in the womb of their mother. Okay. Now, I need to be very clear on this point. There is a clear difference between childhood masturbation and adult masturbation. Childhood masturbation is done because there's a huge bundle of nerves in certain areas of the body that, when they're stimulated, feels really good. Okay. Adult masturbation includes the notion of fantasy, that the person is fantasizing about the act of sex and is gratifying themselves at the same time. Okay. And this is very important from a parent perspective, because a lot of parents walk in on their children and they freak out because they think that the child is doing something of that nature. And this is also a good parenting tool, because what really parents should do is calm themselves down and have a conversation with that child. And if the child says that they did it because they watched someone, or it was done to them, or they were thinking about someone else, it's time to consider getting that child help. Okay. If they just do it and they kind of say, "I don't know," it's probably because that area of the body has a lot of nerve cells and it feels good. And then you can have that conversation based on your own family morals or values that you have about touching those areas of the body, and who should and who shouldn't. The bikini area talk should occur at this moment, and those kinds of things. But that is something that should be discussed. And then another thing that I am going to say at this point, just because we're here, is that as a parent, and I'm saying this as a person who worked with children who were sexually abused, please get comfortable as a parent with your own body and naming body parts for what they are. A penis is a penis and a vagina is a vagina, okay? And don't become a parent who becomes very uncomfortable with naming body parts and deciding to give it cute, comfortable names. Because I will tell you, working with children who were sexually abused and offenders who abused young children, offenders take advantage of parents' naivety and in my opinion, stupidity. And I'm going to give an example. There was a young lady that I worked with who had a young child that was 4 years old. And I don't think I've told this story in this class, have I? I don't think so. A young child, she ended up being separated from her mate, her husband at the time, and ended up needing to take a job. And she had her uncle and aunt, well, it would have been the child's uncle and aunt, so it was her brother, sister-in-law, take care of the child while she was at work. And, she didn't think anything of it. They were good people, churchgoers, all of those types of things. So she didn't think of anything of it. But she was in preschool going into kindergarten at the time. And the teachers got a hold of her and says, there's things going on with her that we don't understand. She seems withheld. She's not being engaged. Her performance is getting low. And the mother also started to notice some behavior changes. She started becoming more aggressive, more irritable. And then one day her daughter came home and she said her uncle was touching her pockets today and was putting his hands in her pockets. And this went on for weeks and weeks. She kept coming home. My uncle is putting his hands in my pockets. Well, one night she was giving her little girl a bath. And as she was leaving the room, she turned around to her little girl and said, "Make sure you wash your pockets really good today." And a light bulb went off. And she realized that her uncle wasn't putting his hands in her coat pockets or her pants pockets. He was putting them in the place that she named her little girl's private parts. And I'm going to put this on everyone's list who's a parent or will become a parent someday. Offenders love it when parents aren't able to give their children proper names for their body parts, and they're playful and they're joyful and everything else, because that's one of the number one thing that offenders will prey upon with your children. So I just wanted to bring that up while we're talking about this phase of development. Now, what did Freud believe if a child wasn't able to control their needs to stimulate themselves? He believed that they became thrill seekers. These were people who couldn't control the need for stimulation and the need for excitement. Okay, and so that's phallic fixation. Freud also argued that there are two things that occur during this phase. One is going to be the Oedipus complex for boys, and Carl Jung, a predecessor of Freud, is going to add the Electra complex for girls. The Oedipus complex comes from a Greek story of a man who killed his father and had sexual relationships with his mothers unknowingly. And this is kind of a phase where Freud believed that the boy is looking at the thing that has brought him the greatest joy in his life and has given him nourishment and everything, and that's his mother. And he recognizes that his mother, the object of his mother's eye, the person that can get closest to her, is his dad. And so he emulates his dad's behavior in order to, in Freudian terms, take over the father role and have sexual relations with his mother, or some type of sexual drive. Carl Jung later added this for girls. For him, it was more of what they called penis envy, where the girl noticed that dad has something that she doesn't, and that's something that she desires. So she emulates the mother, or tries to replace the mother for the father. Okay, that's the weird stuff. And Freud, and to his expense, has had a lot of backlash for this part of his theory, because it's strange the way it's worded, and strange in its context. Yeah, Madison, it is very outrageous. But what Freud was probably trying to get at is there's a very important type of play that children start to do from the age of 2, and it even goes into almost adolescence, and it's called role playing. Role playing is when a child looks at adults in their life and takes on their roles. So, the little kid looks at a firefighter and then goes plays a firefighter, looks at the teacher and then goes plays on teacher. Looks at the police officers and the father and the mother. This is where we play house, and this is where we play doctor. And what the child is they're looking at all of these adult roles, and they're making what they like about them part of who they are, and leaving the rest apart. If we look at the age of 4, that is the number one predictor if a child is going to go to college or not, is their attitudes towards education, their attitude towards what they want to be in life, even though it may be totally different when they become an adult. This is where they're taking on those personality roles. They're learning what adult roles are. Okay. So Freud's idea is a little bit outrageous, but there is some evidence that boys tend to emulate the roles of fathers, and girls emulate the roles of mothers. And we can see now that we've had research long enough with single mother and single father households, we can see the influence of not having same-sex relationships within a family system. So let me explain this. So we find that if mothers raising a young boy does not expose their young boy to healthy male role models, whether it be a healthy boyfriend, uncle, grandfather, whoever it may be, and if fathers raising young girls don't expose young girls to healthy female role models, such as a healthy girlfriend, mother, the grandmother, aunt, something like that, that these children do grow and develop and have extreme difficulties in adult romantic relationships and adult relationships. And a lot of people have argued that that's actually what Freud was getting at. But because of the way he set up his theory, it just sounded weird. But there is a notion to the idea that boys need positive boy role models as much as they need female role models, and girls need female role models and male role models as well. And we find that parents who don't, single parents especially, who don't expose their children to those role models tend to develop complex issues as adults. And the main reason is if you think about what the child is observing during this age group, they're observing how men should communicate and care for women, and how women should care for and communicate with men. And if they don't have that exposure during this age group, then they do have difficulties in adulthood. Okay. Unfortunately, for Freud, his theory just never really took off, as it's just kind of weird the way he stated it. But we see hopefully where he was trying to go for. All right, I wasn't planning on spending this much time on this dude, but we'll finish these other two. Okay. Freud believed that between the age of 6 and puberty, a child went through a latent period where the sexual and aggressive desires weren't as pronounced, and that not much happened during this time except for, maybe building skills and whatnot. This, I think, is an unfortunate thing that Freud did, because when you look at child development literature, the age group that tends to be ignored the most are children between the age of 6 to 11 or 12 when a child goes through puberty. And indeed, when we get to this stage of development, when we start talking about later childhood, we will see most of the data that we have for these children come from schools and teachers who observe these children. But unfortunately, and I think it's very sad that because in the very first developmental theory, it was proposed that not much happens during this age group. This is one of the most understudied age group of children, okay? Then puberty to the age of 18, this should actually say 18. This is where a child goes through the genital phases. This is where they sexually mature. This is where they start having desire and those kinds of things. So this is when, again, the child becomes fully maturated, okay? All right. So that's Freud's theory. And so what are some critiques to it? Well, a few of the critiques is we can see that it did have influence on social aspects of life, okay? If we look at the oral phase and look at popular culture's view of obesity, we can see that there's a falsehood in the idea that overconsumption leads to obesity. In fact, it's just simply not true. A person's metabolism leads more to obesity than how much someone consumes. I think of an example of me and my brother. My brother had a very, very fast metabolism in his adolescence, and he would go to places like McDonald's and eat 5 Big Macs and not gain an ounce. I would eat one and I would gain a pound. But the idea that obesity is caused by overconsumption is unfortunately a sad legacy left by Freud. We talked about the anal phase and how people who tend to be very fixed in their thinking, we define as anal. That came from Freud's theory. So there's been some social influences of Freud. We can see that even though he was, I feel, completely wrong about this Oedipus and Electra stuff, we do see the idea of role playing and the need to have children, be influenced by role models in their life, has a big influence on their outcomes later in life. And the idea of the unconscious, we do know that there are unconscious processes that happen all the time, that we do things that we later can't explain why we do them. And indeed, when we look at neural processes, most of our sensory information goes to the limbic system first, before it's sent to the cerebral areas of the brain where consciousness exists. meaning that there's about a 1 to 2 second delay between our emotional response, how we're going to emotionally respond based on it hitting the limbic system, and our conscious awareness of what we're feeling or what we're going through. And later in the course, when we talk about psychopathology, we'll talk about a disruption in that process we're already emotionally reacting. We become consciously aware of it, and we then choose how to react on that emotion. And we find with many psychopaths, the connection between the choice and the emotions don't exist. So we'll talk about that later in the course. So we do know that there is a lot of unconscious processes that occur. We saw this with the sensations and perceptions examples and in our consciousness discussions in the class so far. So that's a critique of his theory. And like I said, a lot of it is still with us socially, and there's just still some weirdness about it. Okay. So at this time, we're hitting 1224. Is everybody okay with the Freudian theory? Everyone understand it? We're good with it? Okay. All right. Okay, well, I feel like I threw a lot of stuff at you today. We introduced stage theory. We introduced the areas of development. And so we have, Esther, I agree with you. I'm hoping that not everybody feels that we develop sexually through those early years, but it's definitely a thing that has stuck, unfortunately. What I feel like is that let's wait till Friday to get away from that kind of weirdness of developmental theory. And on Friday, we'll introduce two other theories. One by Jean Piaget, which is a cognitive model. So he's going to talk about how we cognitively develop. And we'll talk about another theory by Erik Erikson, which is a socio-emotional model. So how do we develop socially and emotionally over time? The other thing that we're going to see with Erikson is he actually is the first to introduce a lifespan model. So he went from infancy to late adulthood with his theory, and we'll see some different ideas and whatnot with his theory. But I think because of time and whatnot, I think we should go ahead, and I'm pretty sure we're pretty overwhelmed for today. So let's go ahead